Welcome to The Nation, I'm Jason Wee. Nation building did not end with Merdeka. It continues through the way we shape our identity, bring different communities together, and inspire the next generation to take part in the country's future. From the 1998 Commonwealth Games to Rakan Muda and campaigns that presented Malaysia to the world, today's conversation draws on decades of experience in shaping how Malaysians see themselves and see their country. So what does nation building mean today, and what kind of Malaysia are we building for the next generation? Joining me to explore these questions is FARIDAH HAMEED, leadership coach and many years in building the campaigns for what we now know as nation building. Welcome to the program, FARIDAH.
Thank you, Jason.
So you've been behind many iconic nation-building material in your career. Has there been a recent content that has inspired you?
Well, you know, every Merdeka we have this sort of nostalgia type of advertisements that come about. But something that caught my eye a couple of days ago was there was an oil and gas company who featured an ad ostensibly with a Bangladeshi worker, of course played by a Malaysian. And he was talking about his experience dealing with everyday Malaysians through his eyes. And what I liked about that take was, it was kind of an unusual take, because normally Merdeka is very nostalgic, it's Malaysians with Malaysians, multiracial and all of that. And the fact that he was talking about how he observed how Malaysians of every race got on with one another, and I thought that was an interesting take compared to like a Western expatriate or through the lens of a tourist. So what I like about that is that particular ad, I think, is a good reminder to all of us that while we may disagree about things that may be going on in our communities and in our country, there's still a lot of things that are very ordinary coexistence in our lives. And sometimes we forget that, because when you have an outsider who's looking at it and they remind us of it, because you and I, most of us, you know, we go to the mama shop, we complain about things, right?
That's right.
And so I think it's a good reminder that sometimes we need to step out of our echo chambers and look at how other people look at us. So that's why I kind of like that ad.
Just to follow up on that, why do you think it takes an advertisement to make us feel that way? That we can't be reminded of the day-to-day little bits on our day-to-day lives?
I think we are. But I think sometimes it becomes invisible because it's our everyday lives, it's ordinary. And so we don't think it's extraordinary. However, having done a lot of work in communication campaigns and messaging, I think it's always good that we be reminded of these kinds of things, because it's easy to forget.
So let's talk about your career for a moment, FARIDAH. Over the years, you worked on Malaysian campaigns including the 1998 Commonwealth Games, the Bosnia Global Humanitarian Appeal, the KL Peace Award, and we were just chatting just now, even Malaysia Boleh, right? These are works that presented Malaysia to the world and also in a way to ourselves. Did those experiences change how you saw Malaysia and what holds us together?
Definitely, because these were sort of the formative years of my career, and I have to give credit to my ex-boss, the late Tan Sri Lim Kok Wing, from whom I learned so much about messaging nationally and internationally. So you mentioned earlier about the Malaysia Boleh. We worked on the Rakan Muda campaign. We presented what is that song? Kita Satu Malaysia,
right,
Satu Malaysia. And so while I was not always the lead on those campaigns, I was definitely involved in a lot of that. So our work was always in two areas. One is positioning inside the country to our own people, and the other one was externally. So externally was like the 1998 Commonwealth Games, which remains one of the highlights of the work that I did. The KL Peace Award, which was introduced sort of the Eastern response to the Nobel Peace Prize, and Jacques Chirac was the first recipient of that. And then, of course, the Bosnia campaign, which has an emotional connection to me, and I don't know how many of your audience will remember, there was a war in Bosnia-Herzegovina when the former Yugoslavia broke up. So there's a war from 1992 to 1995. Malaysia was very supportive of Bosnia. So to cut a long story short, Tan Sri Lim Kok Wing came up with the idea of a global humanitarian appeal as the country was winding down the war and they wanted to rebuild the country. Now let me tell you a little bit that most people do not know. As part of the work that we were doing on the campaign, we were given videotapes, about 20 videotapes of the torture and the cruelty that the people in Bosnia had to undergo. To be honest with you, I could only watch about two. because these were stories of rape from actual victims and the cruelty as well. And the reason why that touched me so much in a kind of a very formative time of my youth was that I realized, you see, people in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia were neighbors. They had lived together for the longest time, peacefully, no problem, similar cultures and all of that. And yet it was so easy for them to go into an all-out war where they treated their own neighbors so cruelly. And I think, Jason, that is something that we often think, oh, it's not going to happen to us.
Yeah.
But we know from what's happening around the world, it can happen anytime. And that is why I say in Malaysia, we have to protect this. Because what we have is unusual, it's rare, you don't find it in many parts of the world. And those who are trying to poke at it, I believe, are playing with fire.
Just before we get into the Malaysia story and what we tell ourselves, I also want to, I guess, observe that sometimes it's easier to be united when the world is watching,
Yes.
right? When Malaysia is seen as a unit, be it for a foreign campaign or when we are represented in sports. Why do you think unity might be easier to summon when the world is watching?
Well, because we identify ourselves as one. Right? We're not saying I'm a Malaysian Indian, I'm a Malaysian Chinese. Even like when we travel overseas, people ask us where we're from, we say we're Malaysian, right? So I think for any country it's like that. But the way in which we present ourselves to the rest of the world is not always the way we present ourselves at home. Again, that is common everywhere in the world. And I think we just have to be cautious about how we see ourselves and how we identify ourselves in our home.
And that, I think, is the question of nation building. Merdeka happened in 1957, but
Yeah.
building a country doesn't end with independence. Farida, what do you think nation building means for us today?
You're absolutely right, Jason, and that's an important distinction, right? We have independence, we are 69 years now. We're going into 70 next year. And nation building just never ends because every generation inherits what the previous generation built on. And so people like you are in a different Malaysia than my generation. My generation, or my parents' generation, was right after we became Merdeka. So it was a different world in which they have to build. When I came along, it was already Malaysia. That's all I know. And we were on the fast track to development and to build this nation, and we, and ended up with the Petronas Towers. And so, like your generation and younger, the millennials and the Gen Z, I think this is the question that you have to ask yourself: where do we belong? Whose stories are we telling? Because we know sometimes history is skewed. We are not always given the full picture. So, whose stories are we telling? The other thing is, do we understand what it means to be different and to be able to celebrate it? One of the things that I absolutely hate, a word that I absolutely hate whenever I see a Merdeka or politicians talk about sometime, is that word tolerate. What does tolerate actually mean in its definition? Tolerate means you put up with something even though you don't like it. Why can't we not say celebrate? We celebrate our differences, and that differences is what makes us who we are. We are so rich in our culture. Which other country in the world has got people from every other culture that is landed here? And if you see also, Jason, so many foreigners want to come and live in Malaysia because they love it here, right? So I think how we speak about Merdeka, your generation, my generation, because it's not just history, it's also a responsibility.
Yeah. I mean, just to pick up on what you said and also to put you on the spot, you say we need to tell more stories.
Yes.
And whose stories are we telling?
Yes.
Well, Farida, what stories do you think we need to tell today?
To me, the most important story that I think we need to broaden is the many hands that built this country. Because I don't think you can talk about a future if you don't know our history. I know there have been attempts to kind of skew it. And I think that is why officially it may be skewed, but I think the onus is on all of us to share our knowledge of where our history comes from and the many hands that build it. We know of so many people who helped build this country whose stories have not been told. They are not in history books. And so where do we find them? We have to encourage younger people. Maybe they can work on projects in schools, right? Can you go and find out who else built this country? What did they do? What did they die for? Secondly, when talking about the younger Malaysians, people like you and younger, I always wonder how much of our story do they know? Like, for example, could they name someone from another community who built Malaysia? And I think that'll be an interesting man in the street kind of interview to find out what they know. And so I think, yes, there is a little bit of an element of looking backwards, but there is also, of course, that we want to look forward. In 2057, Malaysia will be 100 years old.
Right.
I may no longer be around. You'll be much older. And I think when we talk about patriotism, we love Malaysia and all that. Of course, we all love our country. This is where we were born. But young people need to be given ownership of the story of Malaysia, because it's no longer our job. And we shouldn't just rely on what we've been told. They have to go and find out what does Malaysia mean to them today, not what we are telling them about the nostalgia of the past.
So let's talk about young people, because every time we talk about Merdeka, there's always a focus on what comes next.
Yes.
But I also want to look back a bit into the Rakan Muda campaign that you worked on in 1994, which was a nationwide campaign to build pride, purpose, and community among young Malaysians. Do you think we need something like that again today so that younger Malaysians can understand our Merdeka story and the different roles that communities played? What could that look like for our generation?
Yeah, Rakan Muda was originally conceived as a sort of a sporting initiative to bring young people of different races to come together and play sports. Most of these sports were kind of Malaysian sports, like sepak takraw and the such. And it did incredibly well, because what we saw was that in communities, there were Rakan Muda branches in residential areas, urban, kampong. So it was a very successful campaign. I don't know if that is what we need today in that form. And so what perhaps people like you and younger need to be looking at is, what is a variation of that we could do, and with social media that we have. So in 1994, we didn't have social media. So today, could we tell stories that have not been told? Could we get young people to go into communities and ask people what is their idea of unity? What is their idea of, what do they think of Malaysia and what it is today? There are so many different ways to tell those stories, and I think that would be an interesting social media campaign that you don't have to wait for someone to fund you. Any young person can go and do it and share that knowledge. So I think that is where the storytelling, because we are in social media, I think storytelling will be a very interesting aspect of that.
Because every time I speak to someone who grew up during that Rakan Muda era, they always have a very nostalgic feel that was really a moment in our youth campaign. What do you think that Rakan Muda got right that maybe later campaigns haven't really managed to repeat, in your opinion?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I'm trying to throw my mind back to what it was in 1994. I think we started, Tan Sri Lim Kok Weng started with the idea of, okay, first it's youth. Okay, our youth do not know each other very well. And where can we come in and work with the Ministry of Youth and Sports to do two things? One is to get them healthier, and the other is to get them to talk to one another. I think it was sort of the same time with national service. I'm not 100% sure, but I think there was an effort at that time because the data was showing that people were divided. The young people were not mixing. And so I think what we got right was that it was a campaign that was promoted heavily, and the Ministry of Youth and Sport was actively involved on the ground to ensure that they went into every community and there was a branch there as well.
So, to also, again, put you on the spot, Faridah, if drawing from your lessons from that era, would a campaign designed that way work with young people today? And if you were in, say, the Minister of Youth and Sports position, how would you design a campaign targeted at youth precisely to think about how we tell stories and bring people together once again?
Yeah, that's $1 million idea, so I'm not going to share that right now. What I will say is, I think the ministry has got resources, huge resources, and access to schools, to neighborhoods, and to other forms of education. And so what I would say is, because of social media and storytelling, there could be some kind of a campaign that would give ownership to young people, not dictate, but give ownership to them. Maybe they need to submit ideas of what they want to do. Maybe the ministry can help fund, get them some sponsorship. Choose 5 people. And please include East Malaysia. Because a lot of time this conversation is very peninsula centric. So could we choose 5 people? Could we choose 10 young people? Maybe 5 guys and 5 girls. Go and find out one person could do about the women from history that we don't know about who helped build this country. That would be one story. What about the young people who are doing initiatives and projects, innovative projects for the country? So there are many ways in which this could be done.
At the same time, we are in Merdeka month, and we are in the full peak season of watching Merdeka ads and Merdeka videos. But what does Merdeka mean to Malaysians today? Because we oftentimes assume it means the same thing across different generations and walks of life. But in reality, many youth who didn't or don't have a parent that went through the independence era, they might not be able to sympathize as closely because we are getting deeper and deeper into that history.
That's absolutely true. I think that we kind of fall into this hole of saying Merdeka, unity, all kind of has a universal meaning, and there's universally agreed meaning, and that's not true because we can't flatten Merdeka into one thing. Context matters. So we have the independence generation, and then we have my generation, and then the young generation, right? So for the younger generation, what do they want from the jobs? What would make them stay in Malaysia? For the slightly older generation, maybe 40, 50, 60 years old, are they struggling with dignity, with healthcare, with security? And overseas Malaysians is another aspect that we very seldom talk about, our diaspora. These are people who have left the country for whatever reason to build a better life outside. And we assume that somehow they do that because they don't love Malaysia. And I think perhaps one thing that we need to consider is maybe loving your country doesn't mean pretending that everything is fine. And I think we need to dig a bit deeper to find out why people are leaving and have a conversation about what it would take to bring back the brain drain to our country.
So the question now is, who is going to do this? Because nation building, I think in Malaysia, has traditionally been seen as a government responsibility, right? The one ministry or two ministries are in charge of these campaigns. Should we still expect the government to do most of the work? Or is there a role for businesses and employers to play in bringing Malaysians together?
In 2026, I would challenge the notion that nation building is the government's job. A lot of times they don't do a very good job of it as well. Not because the heart is not there, but because politicians and bureaucrats, it's not in them to actually think of messaging in a way that resonates, particularly with the younger generation. So what I would say is, I would think businesses have got a role to play, a big role to play, because a lot of times they just want to hire people of different races, and that's diversity. But we have to go beyond that because workplace culture shapes our country as well. And businesses have reach, and they have creative power, and they have money. And so what stories could they tell about how they're changing Malaysia? Maybe it doesn't have to be nostalgic or patriotic, but how are they, with their teams, changing what Malaysia is about? One good example is Khairul Aming. When you watch his social media, he's always got a good story behind it. And his recent launch, he went to Terengganu to see the fishermen who fish for ikan bilis. It's those kinds of stories, and I think the entrepreneurs and businesses have to tell more stories.
What about big businesses? Because Malaysians oftentimes work in very multicultural workplaces. Some do not, fair enough. But if a Malaysian CEO comes to you tomorrow to ask, Faridah, what should I change in my company to bring my people closer together? What would you tell this person?
Well, firstly, I would say if you already have a bit of a diverse workforce, that's already great. But if you don't, then look at your hiring. That's the first step, I would say, to bring in not just diversity based on race. We tend to flatten conversations, but diversity of ideas. And to me, that is more important, that you have people who are going to say, this, I don't think this is right, and I think we should do it this way. Bring in people from East Malaysia as well. I think that's where I would start.
So the question we are left sitting this Merdeka, as with every Merdeka, is what kind of Malaysia do you hope we leave to the next generation? Because I think we are in a very tumultuous time, both in our political, domestic scene, but also globally. It is a very challenging time for the world. What do you want to leave behind?
I would like to see a Malaysia that knows how to live with difference. Because I think sometimes we try too hard to make everybody fit into a square box. And that if you don't believe this, then something is wrong with you. You're not patriotic. And so I think I would like to see a Malaysia where we don't need everybody to agree on something. That we can have a different point of view. We can have a respectful conversation about things that we don't agree on. And we can have a robust conversation about areas in which things can be improved. The second thing I would like to see is that we have less suspiciousness about others and more curiosity. I think it's very easy to go down the rabbit hole based on a social media post, a hook, somebody just trying to create trouble and create suspicion. But rather be curious before we react. I think those are very important things. But in a country like Malaysia, where we have people from so many different races, we have to be careful about these things. And that responsibility, in my opinion, rests with all of us. I think it's easy to react. But when we see something that we disagree with, how are we going to respond to that person so that they can open their mind a little bit and see it from our perspective? Because I think the other perspective is not always welcome. And it's not because we don't love Malaysia. I love Malaysia with all my heart. This is the only home I have. That doesn't mean that I don't see what's wrong and I would like things to be improved. That was something that I also learned from Tan Sri Lim Kok Wing. I mean, there is a way to do this where everybody can say, yeah, that's a good thing. That's a good thing that we're doing for our country.
I also want us to maybe paint a picture as we approach the end. We are turning 69 years of Merdeka. Imagine the world in 2057. As you said, that's when we will have 100 years of independence. What do you think Malaysia would look like in that year?
Whatever it's going to look like, the work continues today. And I would like to see a Malaysia where we celebrate our differences, because we could be a great role model for the world. One of the things that I worked on with Tan Sri Lim Kok Wing, we did a lot of work with South Africa and African countries. Do you know why they looked up to Malaysia as a role model? Because they've had their problems in Africa because of the different tribes and all of that. And they just marveled at the fact that Malaysia somehow, even if we hobbled along at moments in our history, we somehow were able to keep it together. It's like a family, right? We fight with one another, we disagree, but somehow we make up and we just go on. And so for me, in 2057, I may not be around anymore, but I would like to see a time when young people, the people who are in their 20s today, 30s like you, who are building companies that are underpinned by this idea of a Malaysia in which all of us have a say and a sense of belonging. Because I come back to that sense of belonging. I think we talk about Malaysia, but there are many people who feel they don't belong for whatever reason. And to me, that would be at the crux or the nexus of what, to me, would have Malaysia has achieved by 2057, is that every Malaysian feels like they belong here, no matter their age, and that the conversation has become more mature about who we are as a nation.
And lastly, Faridah, what are you going to do this Merdeka Day?
I used to watch the flag waving and all of that, but I stopped doing that some time ago. To me, it's really having this conversation with you guys, talking to my friends, talking to my family, and just to remember that I'm very blessed to live in this country. This country has given me a lot. It gave my parents a lot, my grandparents a lot. And I will be eternally grateful for the fact that I was born in this country. I've lived most of my life in this country. I've traveled to many countries. I studied overseas. No country like Malaysia.
Faridah, thank you so much for being with us today. It is such an important conversation, and you, working on so many campaigns, are the best person to share the different stories.
Thank you.
So nation building is something every generation inherits, but also something every generation has a role in shaping. As Malaysia looks ahead on how we build trust, create a sense of belonging, and bring people together, these will be items that's just as important as the policies we put in place. I'm Jason Wee, this has been The Nation. Thank you for watching, and join us again for more in-depth conversations on issues that matter. See you then.